Previously in the complete creation.
And in the case of the Green River fossil paddlefish, it still had preserved cartilage that they managed to remove from the fossil. Thank you for joining me again. I'm your host, Ian Juby. In the last episode, we were looking at historical scientific accounts of finding dinosaur blood still preserved, even with their reddish color intact, in dinosaur bones. The one account from sites in Germany from 1907 may very well be the first account ever. Now, presuming it is, that's still 114 years of reports of dinosaur blood found in the scientific literature, of which we reviewed several instances in the last lecture. Now, this is a startling discovery no matter what your beliefs are. Even as a young Earth creationist who believes my Bible's account of Earth's history, which claims that the dinosaurs, all of life, yea, the planet and the whole universe were all created by God a mere 6,000 years ago. Finding blood still preserved in dinosaur fossils is mind-boggling. Yet, that is far more believable in the biblical timeline than the evolutionary claim that those dinosaur bones are tens of millions of years old, and yet blood has still been preserved in them. Let us briefly revisit where I left off in the last lecture. You'll remember that in 1907, Adolf Seitz wrote about and showed micrographs of red blood cells still containing their reddish color preserved in fossil dinosaur bone. In 1923, Moody wrote his authoritative work on pathology, the study of death, and he himself detailed finding red blood cells in fossil dinosaur bone he had personally excavated in 1906. But Moody, of course, believed the claims of deep time and millions of years. So he was highly skeptical of his own discovery. He recounted Seitz's writings and mistranslated the original German, with the incorrect translation implying that Seitz didn't believe he had found red blood cells, but rather crystals that resembled red blood cells. In actual fact, the exact opposite was the case. Seitz was ruling out all other possibilities except red blood cells. But Moody expressed his skepticism and affirmed his skepticism with what he mistakenly thought was Seitz's skepticism. The reason this is all significant is because Martil and Unwin, writing in 1997 to address all of these copious claims of alleged red blood cells being found in fossils over the past 90 years, cited Moody's skepticism and the mistaken skepticism of Seitz to contend that these were not preserved red blood cells. As part of their research into the matter, Martil and Unwin went looking for and found some of these alleged red blood cells themselves. Oh, hold up! Just how common is it to find preserved red blood cells in dinosaur fossils? Judging by the copious numbers of reports, apparently pretty common. Martil and Unwin argued that what people were actually seeing were pyrite framboids. Pyrite is known as fool's gold and is very common in the fossil record. In fact, Vance Nelson and I, when we were exploring the coal seams of Point Coney in Nova Scotia, the coal seams, of course, contained copious fossils. Vance pointed out how many of the fossils now were actually petrified by pyrite. You can see this fossil wood has the goldish color of the pyrite. I had never actually seen this myself before that day, so this was new to me and frankly very surprising. With regards to Martil and Unwin, I have no doubt that they did in fact find pyrite framboids in the dinosaur bone they examined, but let's critically analyze their work, which they supported with the skepticism of Moody and what they thought, based on Moody's mistaken translation, was the skepticism of Seitz. So here's the original fossil bone, and you can see the channels, which are obviously Haversian canals, crowded with these spheres of alleged red blood cells. Here's one of those clusters magnified. They then acid etched the bone, and this is what it looked like afterwards. And they zoomed in on this knob right here, which they contend is a pyrite framboid. They then compared that knob to a pyrite framboid they obtained from a completely other fossil, some fossil dinosaur poop, coprolite. Now, they bounced all over the place with magnification, so it makes it really hard to follow along to see the problems with what they're claiming. Now, first things first, this is all in black and white. You'll remember Seitz described the red blood cells as being red in color, not gold in color, the color of pyrite. Schweitzer observed the same thing. The cells are clearly translucent and red in color, just like red blood cells and not like pyrite. But I've taken Martil and Unwin's images and scaled them relative to each other so that they are all the same scale. Here's the original bone with lots of clusters of those spheres in question. Here's the close-up of the clusters put to the scale with the original image. Now they acid etched the bone. Wait, where did all the clusters of spheres go? The blood vessels, the Haversian canals, where did they go? They're gone. They've all been apparently removed by the acid etching, and all that's left is this huge knob of unknown material which is resistant to acid. Compare the size of that knob to the size of the spherical objects in question. It is literally more than twice the size of the mystery spheres they were trying to identify. Now, I have no doubt that what they found there is a pyrite framboid. I'm not questioning them on that issue. I think they proved that identification quite well, and I actually have a lot of respect for David Martil as I've followed his works for many years. But that pyrite framboid has nothing to do with the copious numbers of obvious red blood cells that they too found in fossil dinosaur bone. Copious red blood cells that they removed in the processing of the fossil. But let's take it a step farther. In Mary Schweitzer's 2005 paper, she not only documented preserved T-Rex red blood cells, but soaked the fossil in a weak acid to demineralize the fossil. This dissolves the minerals, leaving behind any biological materials, of which she found copious amounts. I mean, here, take a look at the paper and numerous photographs she provided, which were undoubtedly a very small sampling of a much larger group. She found bone cells, osteocytes. She even found T-Rex meat in the marrow of the bone. Now, what you can't see here in this photograph is that this tissue is being stretched. She actually showed video footage of this stretching on multiple television appearances, and the meat just stretches back into its original shape. I propose an experiment. I mean, hey, for something to be scientific, it needs to be testable, observable, repeatable, and predictable, right? So, go to your grocery store and buy a steak and some cooking bones. Go into your backyard, dig a hole, and bury the steak and bones. Come back 1 year later and dig up the steak and bones. Write down your observations. Use your 5 senses. Touch it. Look at it. See what it looks like. Smell it. Taste it. Listen to it. Now, bury it in the ground again, leave it for another year. Come back in another year, dig it up, repeat all the observations, bury it again. Come back in another year, dig it up, repeat all the observations, bury it again. Now do that for 70 million years. Do you think you will find anything remaining? Do you think that you will find flesh on that steak that's still stretchable? Do you think you will still find red blood cells in that bone? Let's take a historical look at remarkable preservation by burial. Tolun Man was the body of a sacrificed human so incredibly well preserved that when the body was discovered in 1950, it was mistaken as a recent murder victim. The body was buried in and preserved by a bog from which multiple bodies were recovered. Now, Tolun Man was dated as around 400 BC with carbon-14 dating. Wait, if you claim dinosaur fossils are getting contaminated with modern-day carbon-14, then you better apply that logic to Tolun Man as well. If you're going to throw out carbon dates for the dinosaurs, then you better toss out the radiocarbon dates for things like Tolun Man as well. But I'm going to go with that claimed age of about 400 BC, so that's about 2,400 years old. Let's look to the future. How well preserved do you think that body will be in another 2,400 years? What about 2,400 years after that? It's not going to stay preserved like this forever. The skin will break down and eventually liquefy. Any soft tissues preserved will break down no matter how good the preservation matter. What will it look like in another 2,400 years? It's now just under 10,000 years old. Even with this remarkable preservation process, the skin, hair, and clothing will have undoubtedly decomposed to nothing. Why? Because Koelbjerg Man, recovered from the same bog and dated at 10,500 years old, was reduced to scattered bones. Now again, I don't believe these dates from Hansen et al. I'm just using the evolutionary community's dates to make a point. So take Koelbjerg Man and leave him sit and rot in the bog for another 2,400 years. So now it's around 13,000 years old. Do you think there will be any soft marrow still preserved in the bones? Any red blood cells still left behind? At what age would you predict that all of these things will have decayed away? 20,000 years? 40,000 years? 100,000 years? All right, let's say 100,000 years, an age for which I would be very, very skeptical that any soft biomatter would still remain, even under these astonishing conditions of preservation. But let's say at 100,000 years, all soft original biomatter has now decayed away. Let's leave the body sit and rot for another 100,000 years. Anything going to be left? Let's let it sit and rot for another 100,000 years. You're now at 300,000 years old, and you have to wait another 69,700,000 evolutionary years to get up to the alleged age of the dinosaur bones. To suggest that the best preserved mummies ever found can be representative of a natural way to preserve dinosaur soft tissues and blood cells for 60 to 70 million years is absurd in the highest order. The evidence strongly supports that the dinosaur remains are on the order of thousands of years old, not millions. So, with the numerous reports over the past century of original biomatter from plants and animals still preserved in the fossils, the Creation Research Society launched the iDino Project, specifically focusing on preserved dinosaur remains. They went to the dig site run by the Glendive Dinosaur Fossil Museum in Glendive, Montana. Do stop in and visit the museum. And if you are able, attend one of the dinosaur digs where you can go and participate in an actual paleontological excavation in the dinosaur bone beds of the world-famous Hell Creek Formation. So, CRS went to the Glendive dig site and struck gold. They found and excavated a Triceratops horn. The first bone collected for the iDino project, and Mark Armitage reached into the inside hollow of the horn and pulled out entire sheets of bone cells, original bone cells. The sheets were so well preserved that they were still stretchy, just like the T-Rex meat that Schweitzer and her team had found. All of this with no preparation to the fossil, no acid solutions, no preservers, nothing. If you catch the Soft Served Dinosaur, episode 26, season 3 of Genesis Week, Mark kindly shared with us video footage of him stretching the sheets of Triceratops bone cells under a microscope. If you recall, I started this discussion in response to the now falsified contention that one cannot carbon date fossils because there is no biomatter left. As you can see for yourself, there is copious amounts of biomatter left. But let's take it a step farther. I had the privilege of meeting Texas geologist John Watson shortly before he died, and I wish I had known who he was at the time I met him, and truly wish I had had more time to learn from him. The man was a walking library and always seemed to dig up incredible historic and scientific findings. Now, in the next couple of lectures, when we deal with the profound evidence that man and dinosaur lived at the same time, you'll see John Watson's name come up again. For the moment, I wish to focus on an article he wrote for the Creation Evidence Museum of Glen Rose, Texas in the 1990s, for which Dr. Carl Baugh has kindly given me permission to reproduce on my website. You can catch it here. You'll remember back to part 2 and 3 of this series, we discussed the Niagara Gorge. I pointed out that the hard limestone ledge at the top of the falls, which varies in thickness over the area, that limestone and shale layers, like just about all other sedimentary layers you find on planet Earth, are provincial in size. You can see the layer marked out on this North American map, where outcrops went east and west of Niagara Falls by 1,000 kilometers or more, outcropping all the way up into the Canadian high Arctic, thousands of kilometers away, and covering a good chunk of New York State. Now, this is where it gets important, because a lot of that rock was excavated during the construction of the Erie Canal over the years of 1793 through to 1825. The limestone and compacted gravels in this formation are assigned to the Silurian and Ordovician, and assigned an average age of 430 million evolutionary years old. Yet, as the workers excavated solid rock and compacted gravels, they routinely encountered toads entombed in solid rock. Not only were the toads not fossilized, not only were they preserved in remarkable condition, the toads were alive. The deep state of hibernation, called torpidity, keeps the toad in stasis as long as the toad is kept in temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. The moment the toad warms up to that temperature, it cannot stay in this state of deep hibernation. Once the toads were freed from solid rock tombs, they warmed up and they would hop around in the presence of multiple eyewitnesses for a while, usually dying within the hour, but sometimes living for days. The American Journal of Science and Arts in 1822 documented the first case. The workmen engaged in blasting rock from the bed of the Erie Canal at Lockport in Niagara County lately discovered in a small cavity in the rock a toad in the torpid state, which on exposure to the air instantly came to life but died in a few moments afterwards. The cavity was only large enough to contain the body without allowing room for motion. To the surface was 6 inches through solid stone. Please notice that the cover of this issue, the article which contains the footnotes about the torpid toads found in solid rock, is an article of alleged fossil human footprints found in a rock on the shores of the Mississippi River at St. Louis. Rocks that today are assigned an age way before the time man was alleged to have evolved. We'll take a close look at the copious fossil human footprints found in the fossil record in the next lecture. To say that there was numerous reports like these living toads is an understatement. Another report from 1829 showed the skepticism from the scientists of the day. Scientists which became convinced upon further investigation of the reports. The discovery of toads in secondary rocks is often announced in public journals. A very particular account was published in the newspapers of one found at Lockport, while they were cutting the canal bed in geodiferous lime rock. I collected all the facts in my power and examined the rock from which it was taken. The evidence would have been sufficient to establish any ordinary fact, but there seemed to be so many ways for illiterate laborers to deceive themselves that I took no further notice of the report. But I have since received an account of a large dark brown toad being found in a rock of millstone grit near Whitesboro, which I cannot hesitate to believe. While laying the cellar wall of Mr. Sill's house, the stonemasons had occasion to split a large stone from the quarry which I call the millstone grit. It was perfectly close-grained and compact. On opening it, they discovered a black or dark brown spherical mass about 3 inches in diameter in a cavity which it filled. On examining it particularly, they found it to be a toad, much larger than the common species and of a darker color. It was perfectly stupid, or in a stupor. It was laid upon a stone and soon began to give signs of life. In a few hours, it would hop moderately on being disturbed. They saw it in the yard moving about moderately for several days, but it was not watched by them any farther, and no one observed its farther movements. They laid one half of the stone in the wall so that the cavity may still be seen. The author goes on to rule out speculations of how a modern frog could have gotten into solid rock, and that this toad must be from before the time of Noah's flood. But frogs and toads found deep below the surface in impenetrable, undisturbed clays and compact gravels was quite common. In the 1831 issue of the American Journal of Science and Arts, they provide details and multiple eyewitness accounts of several of the probably dozens of reports. In answer to the inquiry respecting frogs and toads, I can only say generally that nothing was more common than to find very far from the surface of the earth these animals apparently in perfect health and vigor. They provide multiple eyewitness accounts of one such toad broken free from a cavity in solid limestone. The report that a living toad was found in limestone rock at Lockport in 1822 I well remember. On breaking into a cavity in the stone, a toad fell out and jumped several times. It soon died. Identical reports came out of England, where individual toads, including one turned white, and even small groups of toads were broken free from solid limestone, slate, and sandstones. The workers on the Erie Canal also found hundreds of clams still alive in the diluvial deposits, get this, 45 feet, 15 meters underground. Now, this was before the advent of Lyell's Deep Time and Darwin's heretical book. So the scientists of the day considered these to be ancient deposits from Noah's flood. As if intending to make a point, workers fried some of the clams and ate them. Notice what the author specifically states in his report. He was not questioning the claims of finding living animals buried deep underground. He wanted to settle in his heart that these deposits were in fact ancient, from the time of Noah's flood in his mind. I need not be prolix or wordy in the enumeration of facts of this kind, as similar cases are frequently recorded. My object is to present a case where the deposit is decidedly diluvial. Consequently, these animals must have lain from the time of the deluge, Noah's flood, for the earth in which they are found is too compact for them to be produced by a succession of generations. Therefore, the lives of these animals are greatly prolonged by exclusion from air and light, and their natural age is more than 3,000 years. Notice also that the author throws in a very valid dig against Darwin and his theory of evolution. It should be noted the author was referring to Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, as Charles had not even published his theories yet. Now, while this may surprise some, in a few lectures we're going to see that theories of evolution did not start with Charles, and in fact, the first theories were before the time of Christ. When we get to what would Jesus believe, we'll see why that is significant. These discoveries led to a series of rather cruel and unusual experiments with toads by multiple scientists trying to understand this torpidity. So many reports that I simply do not have the time to compile them here, but they will be listed in the references provided with this video. There were so many reports of living animals being found in solid rock that it wasn't a question of were these legitimate discoveries or was it actually happening, but rather the scientists were asking the question, how was it happening? And that was from scientists of the day who still believed these rocks were a mere 4,000 years old or so. Today, those rocks and deposits are considered Silurian and Ordovician, an average of 430 million evolutionary years old. These reports were publicized before Old Earth became vogue, which boosted the age of these deposits from 3,000 to 4,000 years old to an unprovable assigned age of 430 million years old. Judge for yourself. Which age has more credence and possibility? The examples of original biomatter still being found in fossils and even living organisms from allegedly ancient rocks are far too numerous to include in this lecture. Obviously, there is biological material there that can be carbon dated. Alas, I am out of time for this part. I hope you'll join me again where next we'll explore the evidence that humans lived alongside the dinosaurs.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
So the human stepped in the limestone before the dinosaur came along and stepped in the mud, clipping the freshly made human footprint with its middle toe. Now, one could argue that in this case, humans appeared in the fossil record before the dinosaurs.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video-on-demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.